Not remember, cannot forget. But for them, we would not be. Pilgrim greeters, Wampanoag, are the first peoples of the dawn's early light. Pocahontas saved Jamestown. Tisquantum rescued the pilgrims, greeting them in English as a fellow Christian. Chief Conestoga taught the Continental Congress the ancient Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the foundations of a republic. Chief Shenandoah saved Washington's starving army at Valley Forge, bringing them corn and venison. Oneida Polly Cooper showed the troops how to cook corn. In thanks, Martha Washington gave Polly one of her shaws. The Anasazi modified teosinte to maize and transformed the world. Aymara, who I lived with in the Andes, stopped the European famine by giving the world the potato. Mayans, who I lived with in Guatemala, invented chocolate from cacao. 70% of global foods and medicines originate indigenously. Betrayed in 500 broken treaties, the seventh generation is fulfilling Crazy Horse's vision. The exact way we sinned against them, we are being sinned against. The way they have survived or returning are the same way we must. We must restore the republic via redemption. And in doing so, fulfill Crazy Horse's vision. The red race will rise again and be a blessing for a sick world. Rape born, orphan adopted, blessed bastard, indigenous initiated, martial arts mastered, PSYOPs and special forces served. Intelligence inducted, decades in DEA and DIA, sabotage and slandered, corruption crucibled, deep state betrayed, Yeshua saved. Whistleblower warrior, rejecting revenge, repurposed in redemption, as chaplain, leader, teacher, and truth teller, now America's intelligence officer, following God, leading my family, and rallying all patriots to rescue our republic by restoring our virtuous populace. Welcome. I'm Jeff Prather, and this is the Prather Point. Hey, welcome everybody. Happy to be with you. Trying something new here today. There's a QR code up in the left banner so that you can join the chat if you would like to as well. So special show today, The Secret History of Ancestral America. Author Dr. NATHANIEL JEANSON, biologist, will be joining us shortly. The Bible, Mounds, DNA, and Language, the LENAPE Red Record Parallels Genesis, and the Hidden Heritage of the Original Americans is the theme of today as we approach Thanksgiving, which I always like to do. But first, before we get to that, yet another Trump Bondi DOJ self-sabotage. The judge has dismissed the case against Comey and Letitia James. A federal judge has dismissed cases against former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James, both of whom, of course, set up Trump. We remember that very well. Judge Cameron McGowan Curry, a Clinton appointee, dismissed the case without prejudice, concluding that all actions flowing from Ms. Halligan's defective appointment, including securing and signing Ms. James' indictment, constitute unlawful exercise. So because the U.S. attorney was appointed incorrectly, they are dismissing the case. The Justice Department had argued that even Halligan's appointment were invalid, the indictment should stand. Comey pleaded not guilty to charges that he lied to Congress during a 2020 hearing and obstructed the proceeding. So the Trump Bondi DOJ waits until the last minute of the statute of limitations to go after Comey. That rushes a minor indictment. It wasn't for the coup that Comey set up through the FBI via Flynn to overthrow the election. No, that wasn't it. It was just simply for lying and obstructing to Congress. So it was a lightweight indictment at the last second, but then they did it incorrectly. And the indictment filed in Eastern District of Columbia charged Comey with making false statements to Congress and obstruction of congressional proceeding. Not a word about entrapping Trump via Flynn and the official FBI coup. The ever-Trumpers who refuse to take responsibility for themselves and see him as their Messiah will turn their heads and say he tried. It is not incompetence. It is planned and purposeful negligence to protect the Praetorian Guard deep state. And I was excited about this when it happened. But this is the truth about this. And I know this very well as a former federal special agent. I've worked with a lot of assistant United States attorneys. I've worked with several United States attorneys, including Paul Charlton and others. So Taylor Greene has resigned. Of course, I don't cover politics except as is the other side of war. But she said, standing up for American women who were raped at 14, trafficked and used by rich, powerful men should not result in me being called a traitor and threatened by the President of the United States, whom I fought for. And this is very true. And this is what I have said as a Christian chaplain for ChristChaplaincy.com. And for Team America and for the Prather Point is this is our line in the sand. We're not going to protect these corrupt intelligence agencies that are the Praetorian Guard running our fallen Republic American empire. And at least the Epstein list is going to be released. So in that regard, Prather Point and Team America has been very successful. But to be called a traitor for standing up against the kidnap, rape, and murder of little children. Remember, some as young as 12. There were twins as young as 12. And the graves under the tennis court built at Epstein Island in the berm, which nobody has ever played tennis at, attest to that. So other GOP members are considering following Marjorie Taylor Greene's exit into retirement. Now, she served 5 years. Just a couple after the 5 years, her retirement invest. They don't got to do 20 or 30 like we, 5 years. So she's fully vested. Maybe she'll run for governor. Maybe she'll run for president. But others are exiting as well because they say the White House treats us like garbage and Mike Johnson let it all happen because he wanted it to happen. And more explosive early resignations are coming. And meanwhile, government funding runs out again on January 30th. And many Republicans are upset about this. Johnson is facing a slew of discharge petitions on healthcare, Russia's sanctions, and likely discharge petitions to ban stock trading in Congress. So the corruption continues, is what's really happening here. So why is Trump, Johnson, and the GOP self-sabotaging their own majority? It's not about the grand old party. It's about the uniparty controlled by the intelligence community, deep state Praetorian Guard. It's the same as they purposely failed us in Afghanistan, in the Afghanistan withdrawal, allowing the murder of the valorous 13 who stood their post unto death. It's the same that the FBI, CIA, Fauci, Comey, and Pedo Joe are never prosecuted. The deep state is deranged, demonized, and spellbound to obsess over more chaos and more corruption to cover their abominations of child kidnapping, rape, and sacrifice. And revealed, the Biden regime forced airports to house unvetted aliens. So a new Senate report has laid bare the ways of federal officials under the Biden regime. Using a 47-page document titled Flight Risk comes from the Senate Commerce Committee and details how the White House leaned on the Department of Transportation and its agencies to scout and use airport spaces for illegal alien housing. Emails reveal the urgency from the onslaught caused by Biden's insane opening of the borders. It's not insane, it's evil, it's intentional harm. That's what evil is. There was nothing insane about it. It is purposeful depopulation by repopulation. It's the same thing that was done to the tribes, exactly, destroying the bison, the buffalo, and the Indian ponies to completely create a new type of economy. That's what I was saying in my intro there. The same sins we committed against the tribes are now being committed against us. And so we must learn from the tribes. That was my initial intro message about Tachunke Witko, which is Crazy Horse's vision. So at least 11 major airports from Boston, Logan to Chicago O'Hare and New York JFK face pressure to open terminals, hangars, or other buildings to migrants. And I told how one of my students, my pistol craft students in Tucson, pulled up in his black SUV and somebody approached him and said, "Hey, are you ready to load up the illegals?" And I've shown how the illegals were protected by sheriff's deputies in camps south of Tucson and in hotels. And there has been no confession and repentance by all of these local and federal law enforcement officials. And that has not been led by Trump, of course, because he says he's not Christian. And so a Christic protocol is, of course, to self-reflect, open up, listen for the great Holy Spirit, then repent, confess, and ask forgiveness. That has never happened. That needs to happen. Otherwise, the same people who were child trafficking before will just go back to child trafficking the next time somebody says, "Well, I'm just doing my job," which, of course, the Nuremberg trials showed were not appropriate. So we've got another Senate government report telling us what we saw, what we already knew, and holding no one accountable. And this is the sad fact, and I was a big fan of Trump, but this is what we are seeing day after day. So America is now becoming Venezuela. The elite are moving into high security fortress communities guarded by teams of armed professionals because they understand what is happening. So the global cabal, which is the international deep state, which is the intelligence agencies, which work together, the Five Eyes, Seven Eyes, through the UN Darien camp, through Venezuela, have brought all of these illegals throughout the country to, again, transform nation states, make them borderless, make them transnational corporate regions so that the oligarch elite can control to destroy the middle class in America. So remember, I told you when I was overseas working, we were always housed in palatial safe houses because there wasn't a middle class to put a housing to put us in, and to put us in the lower class housing would just been abject poverty. So we were always housed up. But that's what they are destroying, the middle class in America. That's the great engine of the American economy, is the small businessman. It's not big business. It's not big pharma. It's not big tech. It's small business, the American entrepreneur. But they are carefully destroying that, consciously destroying that. And now there are these elite communities. And these are starting off in Florida that are high security fortress communities. And so this is looking like Venezuela. I said America would look like Venezuela. I worked Venezuela. And so just last month, Hollywood A-lister Mark Wahlberg made headlines when he dropped $37 million on a newly constructed mega mansion inside this special enclave community in Florida. Also, Rockstar energy drink founder Russ Weiner made the same thing of $43 million on his two properties in Indian Creek Village. Interesting that they call it Indian, which of course is not an insult. Remember, Indian comes from Endio, in God. So it's not Native American if you're born here. So Indian Creek Village, known as the Billionaire Bunker, isn't just another gated community. It's the ultimate fortress for the ultra-rich, nestled in South Florida's Biscayne Bay, this private island where some of the world's wealthiest people, including Jeff Bezos and Tom Brady, have decided to stake their claim. Ironically, Indian Creek delivers an Israeli-designed radar system, rings the island. It's a system that can detect anyone approaching half a mile away. Cameras are everywhere. The police force are more like bodyguards for the residents, with 19 officials for just 89 residents. They're trained in tactical operations and armed with a fully automatic weapon. Once upon a time, the ultra-wealthy preferred living in large cities such as Los Angeles or New York City, but those times have changed. They have changed them purposefully. So this is what I saw, 20 years ago in Venezuela, is the police running around in armed camps. The police were actually killing the marginales, the orphans, the orphan kids that just run the streets. And they are really there only for the rich. That's what we are heading towards in our fallen republic and our failing American empire. And again, there is only one way to restore this, and that is through Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Christ, and follow Christic protocols, which he taught, which are self-reflect, receive the Holy Spirit, confess, and repent. And that's what Western civilization is founded on. So the purposeful destruction of a lifeway is what indigenous America endured and survived. And now it is our turn to learn from that. And of course, I always talk about how American exceptionalism is based upon Americans' exceptional love of life and freedom. We love life and freedom so much that we'll send our sons and daughters out to fight, kill, and die for it. Of course, I'm a veteran. We love life and freedom so much that we'll send our sons and daughters out to foreign lands to fight, kill, and die for it. And when we are unleashed, and we are rarely unleashed, we haven't been unleashed since World War II, but when we are unleashed, we always win, because the world has never seen the equal of the American warrior, we do something no one else in the history of the world has ever done. We give that country back because we love life and freedom so much, because God says life and freedom are good. Good is intentional help. Evil is intentional harm. And so, what made us that way, but created that national ethic of American exceptionalism of life, love for life and freedom, is our national ethics. Our national ethics come from our morals. Our morals, I think, come from the trinity of Mosaic law. I'm not saying Judaism, because modern Judaism is not what Judaism was. That's why they're trying to build the third temple. I'm certainly not talking about Zionism. Rabbinic Judaism is a makeup of traditional Hebrew religion after the temple fell, but the Mosaic laws are God-given. Hey, if you do these things, you'll be better off. And then the two Christic commandments, which is love God with your whole heart, might, and power, and love your neighbor as yourself, which are taken from Deuteronomy and Numbers, which are Torah, which are Old Testament, and they're the central commandments. And also, though, the two indigenous warrior commandments that I learned from my Apache elder, Philip Casador, and that is never harm the children, and all is born of woman. So if you put those three things together, I think you get American exceptionalism. I think never harming the children and all is born of woman is particularly important these days when they're trying to say, killing children and selling fresh-born killed fetuses, and then trying to say men are women, and women can bear children, and all of that. And so, as we approach Thanksgiving, I think it is important to give thanks, not just to God, but to our heritage, what has made us great, and what has made us, and America was great because she was good. She was good because she was godly. We, I think, are trying to return to being a virtuous populace, and that is my mission on the Prather Point. That's Team America's mission. That's part of Christ Connection Chaplaincy's mission. But while we may look at the Mosaic foundation and, of course, the Christic commandments, which is the centerpiece because Yeshua is the Mashiach, Jesus is the Christ, is the way, there is also the third piece that often people miss, and that is the indigenous piece, because there were great peoples here long before we were here, and they showed the way with the Haudenosaunee Longhouse Confederation. Benjamin Franklin looked at that. That was the formation of government. I talked about the potato. I talked about teosinte, grass becoming corn. All of those ways were here before, and they are very rarely acknowledged. And that's to cover up, I think, via ethnocentrism at the least, or racism at the best. But it's really important to acknowledge our heritage and our ancestors, and give credit where credit has been denied. And credit has been denied, of course, because of all the murder and genocide and conquest, and to make America look like a wilderness when there were towns, there were fields, there were farms, there were great civilizations here. And so that brings me to my guest, who I've been studying and following for quite some time. Dr. Nathaniel JEANSON is a biologist. He works with the ARC project, the rebuilt ARC in Kentucky. He works with the Creation Museum. He's also on YouTube doing Answers in Genesis, which I really love, because he's starting to answer, along with others, pushing back against the scientism of Darwinism, which has been misproven and is continuing to be misproven all the times. But he has also done a lot of great work for the indigenous people in a very honor and respectful way, which you rarely see from Christians and you rarely see from scientists as well. He's the author of Traced. He's the author of Replacing Darwin, Lost Treasures of Genesis, and his latest book is They Had Names. Welcome to the Prather Point, sir.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So I hope I gave you a good intro there. Anything I missed?
That was very kind. Thank you.
So I really love your stuff. And one of the first things I noticed about it is when you were talking about, there's so much to cover. I'm not sure where we should start, but I'll just say personally, I was adopted. I found out my birth mom was from Indian Territory in Oklahoma. In my book, I was adopted and trained by an Apache elder, Philip Casador, very famous for reestablishing the sunrise ceremony, the Naia ceremony, and I got to sing in that and speak some Apache. So Handa, welcome in Apache, Dagote. But one of the things he taught me, which it took me a long time to understand, was, and you kind of see this in the Apocalypto movie of Mel Gibson, is you're like, why are these guys living hard out in the jungle like this? And then when you get into the big Aztec and Mexica city of death, cult of death, you see why they're out in the, and he basically, that's what he said is the Apache had, and a lot of the tribes had abandoned those pyramid or ziggurat, I think falsely called mounds of Cahokia, the Talladega, I think you call them. And those civilizations had receded south. But the North American free tribes, as they moved, had already rejected that way of death and slavery, and were preferring a much more free lifestyle, which is where you get the Apache, the Comanche, the Lakota, all of those. At least that's the way I saw it. And I thought that your research lined up. I thought that was really cool. I don't know if do I have that right?
I think that my impression of the reasons for migration are varied and complex and multifaceted, as I guess you'd expect for any group around the globe. So Cahokians moved south, yes. If I recall correctly, the Mescalero Apache have a girl's puberty ceremony. They talk about migrating from the north, from Canada, where they're linguistically related. Lakota, I think, depending on who you talk to, will say either. I think if you talk to their Algonquian neighbors, they'll say, yeah, we acquired guns from Europeans, and so we pushed them out of Minnesota onto the plains. The Lakota will insist that no one pushed them out into the plains. They just went out there of their own free will. So sometimes really? It depends on who you talk to as well. So
well, no, I had a Dakota elder that taught me how to pray with the chanupa, the pipe, and he talks about the lala, because there's Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota. And it kind of, Pila Mila Yo is thank you in the Western dialect. Pila Mila Yo is the more original Eastern, Santee Western. But I was also fascinated to see that you looked at something a lot of arrogant scientists don't do, looking at oral traditions. And I think Westerners don't understand that those oral traditions are very detailed schoolings, usually through songs. Like my teacher talked about how there were morning songs, day songs, evening songs, and that you could walk very much like the Aborigines could and identify songs with places. The Apache do this too, place names with places, and that activates ancestral memories in storytelling. It seems to me you've aligned a lot of that with your DNA haplotype work along with your language work. Is that right?
Yes, and the process for me, I don't know that I went into it assuming these indigenous histories were going to be true as much as I went into the research, and actually I really didn't even go into Native American history. And originally it was just trying to understand human history globally, and the Native American, or I should say the post-European arrival population collapse, was a key tool genetically to figure out, okay, how does this tree oriented? Where's the beginning? How do we measure time? All that. Let's look for things that we know. We know there's a population collapse. Let's see if we can find the genetic echo. And then it just blossomed from there, where, just to cover the dominoes very quickly, finding the genetic echo of the post-European arrival population collapse, where there were, middle of the road estimate now is about 50 to 60 million people in 1491. 80 to 90% of them disappear in the centuries following due to disease, enslavement, war, and a variety of other factors. Once we were able to find the genetic echo of that, that gave me confidence. We could then look back earlier to the pre-European era and try to understand what the genetics told us about what transpired. And then that's where the links to Native American history came in. One of the most important initial links was with this red record of the Wallam Olam of the Delaware, which of course is officially marginalized or rejected as authentic because of a 1995 thesis. Well, long story short, it matches modern genetics. So I don't have answers for all the objections to it, but I'm like, I don't see how a forgery can anticipate genetic discoveries centuries in advance.
Because it's just like they destroyed all there's always a tradition of destroying winter counts, of destroying, Aztec and Mexica books, because if you want to claim that this is a wilderness and that you just move into an unspoiled wilderness, then you can't claim that there was a civilization here. That's, for example, what I've been taught, and I'm a horseman. I teach natural native horsemanship, and the original little horse was here, and then the Ice Age came and died out. But the tribes say down in the southeast, the Ice Age did not hit, so the native horse survived. It's a cayuse. It's a smaller pony. And I think you can even see that in the Lakota, who is named American Horse. And he was, Lakota were really tall guys. They still are. And they used to be super healthy. And he was so tall that when he got on the little Indian ponies, his feet touched the ground. So he had to go buy American horses. I think that, I don't know if you've heard that, but that sounds to me like something you could investigate.
Yes, I've heard rumors about horses here before European introduction, and I haven't been able to investigate personally yet, but it is a fascinating area. It's something that should be quite feasible to do because we have a number of horse breed DNA samples. I guess once wild, now domesticated, now wild again horse. We've got their relatives, the Asiatic asses, the zebras. Anyway, so the tools I think are there for someone who wants to investigate it. I just haven't done it yet myself, and I find the hypothesis very intriguing.
Yeah, I do too. But again, the reason for that is because in Spanish, caballero is horseman, but that's a noble because the noble would ride the land. So if you end up having Indians on horses before you bring them horses, you're giving them kind of an early status of nobility. Just like Pocahontas was called princess originally. When the cultures were more equal, they were referred to by royal terms. But later on, for submission, that I think is the political angle. I don't know if that's not something you comment on or not, but that I just want to give you my point of view on that.
I've studiously tried to avoid the political side just to be able to focus on the history and avoid conflicts and establish relationships. So that all may be true, but it was more a choice of mine to try to stick to what I can find historically and scientifically, and then let everyone else figure out the politics from it.
So you're a biologist, and you are a Christian, and you are a creationist scientist. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so, at the intro there, I was talking about how Darwinism, scientism, and evolution scientism, not science, but scientism, which is the new state religion that you have to believe in, is continually being disproven. So, and I was looking at some of your stuff on that, but I'd like you to comment on that, because it looks like every year more Darwinism and evolution is disproven, even though it's still taught, and creationism is proven to be more and more true every year.
There's a couple of points I think very relevant here, and acquire even greater relevance in historical context. So there's been a long history of, I'd say, anti-evolutionary discussion, evidence going back to, let's say, the 1970s. So my understanding, just to kind of sketch the young Earth creation debate, I'm told, I was born 1980, that 1961, which was the publication of the Genesis Flood by Henry Morris, and he was a hydrologist, John Whitcomb was a theologian, was a real watershed moment, sort of marks the modern young Earth creationist revival, showed how the fossil record fits this idea of a global flood and so on. 1970s was a real wave of enthusiasm. They're doing college debates that we don't see anymore, thousands of students coming out. And it grew to such an extent that states even passed laws mandating equal time treatment. So if we're going to teach evolution, they said we should also teach creation science. Let the students decide, expose them to both, show them the evidence for and against, and so on. And in the early 1980s is when these got overturned, the equal time laws, saying it wasn't enough to simply criticize evolution, though those were very persuasive arguments. I still endorse them. That many of them, at least, the court said there had to be more than that. The intelligent design community and movement was born out of that. They said, well, if the courts are going to say we can't teach creation science, maybe if we strip it down just to a vague designer and show that, yes, we can infer design. Yes, there's strong arguments against evolution. And I would say the intelligent design community enhanced the anti-evolutionary arguments. One of the most powerful is Michael Behe's. His book, Darwin's Black Box, showed that at the molecular level, essentially, Darwinian evolution is impossible. It's been out for more than 20 years. No one's been able to refute it. It's kind of laughable because the arguments against it fall into a number of different categories. But once again, the courts, 2005, the Dover trial, ruled against it, saying, again, it's not enough just to refute evolution. So that's, I think, a good place to just reflect for a moment and say, if there's such strong arguments against evolution, and there are, origin of life is impossible naturalistically. Again, Darwin's black box shows evolution can't happen naturalistically. Then what exactly do the courts want? If evolution is this sacred cow that you can't discuss openly with all of its foibles and wrinkles and warts and reject it if necessary when the evidence doesn't fit it, what are they demanding? And the short answer is, and a good analogy is, essentially what they said is, this criticism of evolution is like lawyer work. It's cross-examination of the evidence. Very good, very effective, again, cross-examination of the evidence. The court said, nope, not enough. You've got to also do detective work. Go out, find a question, get your own funding, do some experiments, go and solve a question, then come back to us. And that's really what I've been doing for the last 15 years, is trying to address that concern, develop a whole scientific framework. Yes, I would say evolution has been thoroughly debunked scientifically, but then bringing the other side of the equation up to speed as to, can we develop a scientific framework? Can we do detective work from a creationist perspective? And really, the Native American research I've been doing is the tip of that spear. And I think, in a sense, indirectly, we've seen the fruits of this. So when we do videos online on YouTube, some of them have gone viral, and that's not a measure of scientific veracity as much as I think what that shows is we're tapping into a felt need. Here's a question the evolutionists have not been able to solve in any sort of coherent way where they can connect archaeological sites to tribes and nations we recognize at contact. Creation science comes along and connects the dots, solves things, and even people who don't necessarily want to listen to the Bible are saying, I think you're onto something. So that, I think, shows the fruits of what happens when you start doing this detective work. And my hope is someday this leads to the reversal of those court decisions, and students can once again be exposed to creation science and not have it overruled and kicked out and only hear one thing their entire career.
And since you don't want to comment on why you think the courts want to keep it that way and the universities want to keep it that way, it's because it's an industry.
Oh yes, this is a really interesting point that goes back to Darwin too, because I read it in the last 15 years, I forget at what point, an article, I think it was in the British Journal of the History of Science. So not a creationist publication. And they were talking about, how did Darwin succeed, and could he have succeeded, let's say in 2025 or 1987, whatever the year was they published it.
Could not have. Not with the microscopes of today.
And well, their point was it was economic and historical, that Darwin just so happened to live at the right time in history where science was transitioning from a hobby of the independently wealthy to a career with lots of funding behind it. And he specifically appealed to the up-and-coming generation that was career-based and didn't even try to convince his peers or those older of the previous generation. And so it raises the question, could Darwin, or could a Darwin-like figure succeed in today's environment where it is literally a multi-billion-dollar industry? Just the U.S. government alone, through the National Institutes of Health, I think has an annual budget, or did have an annual budget of $45 billion. That's a huge amount of money. So if you have something that's contrary to the mainstream opinion, how do you have any chance of success? Could you achieve what Darwin did in reversing the scientific consensus when there is this gigantic dollar sign behind it? That's a very valid question, I think.
Well, we've seen the weapon, not only the corruption, but the weaponization of Western medicine completely, as an industry, big pharma. I talk about all that all the time, but the tribes all talk about creator. In Inde, in Apache, it's Bichehedan, life giver, or Ulsen, the one God. And it's not just the Mescaleros, San Carlos Apache. It's White Mountain Apache have a sunrise ceremony, which talks about child born of water, which talks about Islan de Lehe, mother of life, getting an abalone shell for the flood. And so it kind of takes up, and the dragon wants to eat her children. So it kind of takes up Revelation, actually, literally, but you've really followed that through the LENAPE, the Free People, Delaware Red record that corresponds very closely to Genesis, haven't you?
Yes, there's I'd say we can divide it into two sections. There's an earlier section to the Red Record, which has very strong parallels to Genesis 1, 2, 3. So they have something that sounds very much like Genesis 1, 1, 1, 2. They have first man, first woman, I think, if I recall. They've got a fall. They've got a flood. In this case, the flood is not caused by God as judgment on man, but it's the serpent who causes the flood. They have an ice age. So this is a document that comes to Western attention in the early 1800s. And I think it describes an ice age even before it became mainstream science. So there's all sorts of really interesting early clues in this document. But the majority of the document, and the one that connects so closely to genetics, is this migration from Asia, and basically a sachem by sachem, or leader or chieftain by chieftain account of who it was. Basically stanzas of so-and-so was the chieftain, and here's what happened. We planted corn, or so-and-so was the chieftain, then we went eastward, or we fought enemies over here in the plains, and so on. And that's the part where we can line it up very closely with genetics. There's internal clues in the Red Record as to its timing, and then it overlaps very closely with what modern genetics has shown us. And so this opens up a whole new window into the past as to what happened, not just for the Delaware, not even just for their linguistic relatives. So I've made the argument, I think you can show from clues in the Red Record, line them up with linguistics. It's actually an account of the entire language family, the Algic language family, which includes Delaware, the Wampanoag, Micmac, Shawnee, Illinois, Cheyenne, Blackfoot, Blackfeet, and so on. But the document, in addition, describes some of their enemies. So you can begin to line this up with, okay, we fought enemies in the plains. We call them the North Walkers. Who might be walking from the north? Well, maybe the Athabascans they already encountered when they first arrived in Alaska. Could be the ancestors of the Apache and the Navajo coming south. So it's these sorts of things that have been very refreshing. Number one, because it shows, again, it adds to the veracity of the document, where it's not just genetics, it's linguistics, it's crosstalk with other indigenous histories, where it's all coming together and agreeing. But the second point of satisfaction is it adds even more then to the map, to our knowledge of what exactly transpired. I grew up knowing nothing about pre-European America. So just to see, oh, here's what happened. Here's another event that transpired. Here's another battle that happened. It is just a wonderful light bulb moment. Not that it's something I forgot, as much as, there was nothing. It was just darkness of, I don't know how to even visualize this. And then to see this pop up, okay, this is how it went down.
Yeah, that's always driven me crazy. Maybe it's because of my heritage. People talk about the rancher heritage, but then all of a sudden everything just stops. There's nothing before, which is not, the truth at all. But I like how you've actually said there are heroes, and you've named these sachems, just like with Tatanka, Yotanka, Sitting Bull, and you were talking. So can you go over some of that as you talk about that journey of the LENAPE?
Yeah. So part of the reason for the name of the book, They Had Names, is I've set up the Native American history next to European history. So I grew up, my mother's German, went to Germany many times just to see relatives, but also do sightseeing things. I'm like, you go to Europe and you can't help but turn around and bump into some sort of Middle Ages cathedral or castle everywhere you go. The history is impossible to miss. And it's a glaring contrast then to when you come to the Americas, return to the United States, of course, where I grew up, and then say, well, where's the ruins? Where's the history? And for Europe, again, it's not just ruins with dates and battles, but it is names of kings and names of peoples. And so They Had Names as now we can connect not just tribes at contact to archaeological ruins, but we have the names of the people. And this is not because of genetics per se. It's a corroborating clue, but the names themselves come from the indigenous histories. So the Crusher being one of the sachems who was involved in the biggest battle in pre-European North American history. And just to set that up briefly, the Algic migration, the Delaware and their relatives coming down from Asia into Alaska, down the western coast of Canada, over the Rockies into the Great Plains. They fought a number of battles on the Great Plains, went eastward to escape it, and run into the Red Record calls them the Telegas. They said they possessed the East. And I in the book, I go through the clues we have that allows us to identify the Telegas with the Mississippian culture, and beyond that with the Natchez themselves, whose own indigenous history describes the extent of their rule in a manner very similar to the Mississippian culture. They also describe coming from Mexico, which I think explains the flat top shape of some of these mounds. European Americans have thought that for many years. It seemed like it came from Mexico. Well, here's an indigenous account that confirms it. Anyway, these are the people that the Algics run into at Mississippi, at Cahokia, we can now identify, and wanted to go eastward. They tried a diplomatic solution. They got slaughtered initially. And then with allies from the north, who I think are the ancestors of Lakota and others, were able to defeat the Natchez, the Cahokians, the Mississippian culture, the Telega people. And the Stirring, I think, was one of the early sachems. Crusher was another. The document describes a whole list of sachems involved in this. So now, okay, here's the names of the heroes. Here's the victors who were able to unsettle what was a major empire in pre-European North America. And I was just talking with someone else recently. If you extend that cause, effect, and domino relationship forward, it does make you wonder. Let's say there was an empire in North America at the time of contact. Let's say the Natchez, that Telegas that the Red Record refers to, defeated the Algics, maintained their empire, had a unified front against the Europeans. Would the Native Americans have won? All sorts of alternative scenarios. What if? And it's interesting to think about, given that so archaeology describes the Mississippian culture after that defeat as, there's one archaeologist who says it's like the blinking lights of a Christmas tree in the southeast, what's now Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, some parts of Florida and such, Tennessee. It's like there's little mini kingdoms that pop up, disappear, very disunified. That's what I think DeSoto and others encounter when they arrive a couple centuries later. This is what Europeans encounter as they're pushing westward from the eastern coast, where they first land in Massachusetts and Atlantic coast in the Carolinas and such. So what if there were not the blinking lights of a Christmas tree, where it's little petty kingdoms, but there was one empire and there was unity? Would there have been a front, and would the history have played out differently?
Yeah, there's an alternate history series where the Romans come to America and the Cahokians unify with the Lakotas and they win. But they've got like hang gliders going off the mounds as well. But I think there's been discoveries of human sacrifice at Cahokia. For the audience who doesn't know, Cahokia was this giant city complex on the Mississippi, run on corn. But from what I was taught, this was an outgrowth or part of the Central American Azteca, Mexica. They called themselves Mexica, but everybody calls them Aztecan. But of the death cults, that there was human sacrifice at Cahokia as well. And then this is what everybody was fighting against. And I think the last one in America was like in the 1400s at a Pawnee, because they were Earth Lodge people too. Do you know anything about that? Does that all sound right?
The Natchez described coming from Mexico for sure, and the archaeology at Cahokia is consistent with that. There's a Mound 72 that's has these sacrificial victims in them. It does seem like a very authoritarian culture. It was fascinating to visit, and yes, you can. I'm sure you know this, and for the viewers and listeners as well. It's a wonderful sight to see and walk through, just to sense what it was like to walk in the footsteps of those who were there before. And what I walked away with was, this is a place where the leaders are constantly reminding those under them, we're in charge. And that attitude,
we're higher than you.
Exactly.
We're literally above you. Yeah, I'm from Ohio, by the way. So I've been to the Serpent Mountain, all the mounds you're talking about. But I think even just calling them mounds, because they were ziggurats, really. And you mentioned this in one of your videos at a mound park cemetery or something, and how they are not investigated. They are not archaeologically renowned as they should be. And just even calling them mounds and not ziggurats or pyramids, which they're bigger than in width than the Giza pyramid is a part of the ethnocentrism and a part of the rewriting of history. Would you agree?
I'd say there is a difference between the north of the Rio Grande and south of it, where in Mesoamerica, which is part of Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and such parts of Honduras, there you do have the stone temples, the stone pyramids, and there doesn't seem to be the exact equivalent up in North America. The history does seem to transpire differently up here than it does down there, but there is a clear architectural similarity in terms of the shape of the mounds. The flat top mounds are different than the mounds that came before. They are built of, so let me clarify, the flat top mounds in North America are different from other earthwork mounds in North America. They're also different in terms of their construction from Mesoamerica. Of course, they're made of earth, but they are huge. I think the Cahokian Monk's Mound, the biggest chieftain's mound just outside St. Louis, is the biggest earthwork mound in North America, if not in all the Americas. I think it's 22 million cubic feet of fill. So it's a tremendous effort to have built it. The Natchez themselves say they left Mexico to come up to North America, or to north of the Rio Grande, which is up to Cahokia and such, eventually outside St. Louis, because the Mesoamerican leaders, they called them the Ancient Ones, kept having these squabbles amongst themselves, and so they got tired of it, and they left and went north to escape it. But there is a link down to that region. I don't know which Mesoamerican tribe it would have been that they were back then, but that was the region they came from. I guess to answer your question, I've been fine with mounds just because I'm like, it is earthwork. What I don't think I appreciated is there's a whole sequence and a history that they tell. Even going back to my own hometown in Racine, Wisconsin, not exactly a metropolis, not well known, 80,000 people. I think it might be shrinking, but we had Mound Cemetery. Goes back to the sign says 1852, I think, and it's a city cemetery. There's famous Racinians buried there, probably not necessarily nationally known, like J.I. Case and S.C. Johnson and such. But there's Indian mounds that we passed every Sunday going to church and didn't think twice about them. Well, it turns out they go back to the time of Christ, and some of them had been excavated in the 1800s. People were sitting up facing east, reasons unknown. But as soon as the dots began to connect for me, and then I told my mother, like, hey, guess what? These mounds that we pass all the time, they're from the time of Christ, and here's the details about them, and here's the significance, and there's mystery about them. Boom, she got to the cemetery quicker than I could. I'm living in northern Kentucky, but as soon as I got back to Wisconsin, went and visited them. So there was new excitement, like, oh, wait a minute. Now we have a framework in which to understand this. These are peoples who have an ancient history, then they disappeared, then other people arrive on the scene, and just to be able to go back and visit it, in a sense, for the first time, because we didn't pay attention to it, but then understand what it means has been part of the excitement for me, just because, again, I've got this sort of this parallel world of Europe where you've got ruins and all sorts of structures that tell a story, and I taught a story. In the Americas, well, where are the structures and what's the story? The structures are here, the mounds are here, and now we've got a history to explain them. That's been very satisfying, again, because I'm born and raised in the United States, born in Milwaukee. And so, it's home for me, even though ancestry goes back to Europe, but this is all I've known. And to finally understand, this is what transpired before I was born, before Europeans ever arrived. This is the history of those who came before. That's been very refreshing.
I'm so glad you're bringing that up, because, again, like my intro said, Chief Canastego teaches the Continental Congress about the Confederation. Benjamin Franklin referred to that, and he was always referring to, hey, when our guys go to the Indians, they never come back, and we try and convert the Indians, and they're not changing. In fact, what destroyed the Iroquois Confederacy was the Oneida sided with the Americans against the British, and that thing was hundreds of years old already. So there's a political heritage there. There's the potato, there's corn, the teosinte being manipulated into maize. There's a lot there, plus all the roads, all the farms, all of that was already there. And I really like how you're acknowledging it. So I think if I got this right, you said the Lenape, the Delaware, aligned with the Lakota and crushed the Talladegas at Cahokia, and that corresponds with Cahokia going vacant.
Exactly.
Right?
So the pieces that came together here were for me, then, at least in terms of the history of these discoveries. First, genetically being able to line up the Algonquians, the Delaware, and others with a specific genetic branch. The genetic branch confirms the time frame within the Red Record. The Red Record does have a time frame if you read it straightforward, but there was a couple centuries of ambiguity. This helped to nail it down exactly which century that the Algics, the Algonquins, arrived in the Americas, which then you can kind of knock down the rest of the dominoes in the Red Record and say, okay, this big battle happens late 1200s. And the defeat of the Cahokians happens in late 1200s, early 1300s, and lo and behold, that's exactly when archaeology says Cahokia is abandoned. There's this whole area called the vacant quarter around there. And from that point forward, looking throughout the rest of the southeast of the United States, there is this, in the centuries following, blinking on and off of the Christmas light, so to speak, where what was once a unified, apparently, empire now becomes a bunch of petty kingdoms, as perhaps they vie for supremacy or continue to deal with enemies. So after that, just to continue the migration of the Algonquians across the Mississippi, once they get across the Mississippi, it says the Shawnee went south, their own, or they left, and the Shawnee's own history says we went down to Florida and came back. So again, I think it's logical to wonder, were they involved in helping those lights of those civilizations kind of blink on and off because they're defeating them and continuing the conquest that the Delawares had achieved in crossing the Mississippi? So that's the sequence of events I had in my head, and you might have to repeat your question because I got excited and went down this rabbit trail. But that was the cause and effect for me.
No, well, I was asking, you answered my question, which was
Okay.
explaining when and why Cahokia went vacant. Was the Lenape alignment with the Lakotas and maybe the Sotai, the Cheyenne or something as well? Because those were very fierce, strong tribes, on the plains as well. No, that's very, and so on Rumble, you guys, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in. Yes, our family's fully recovered from the house fire. Thank you for asking, but I'd really rather you asked Dr. JEANSON questions about what we're talking about. I know it's kind of a deep subject, but it's really fascinating to me to see all this fit together, because again, it fits again with what I was taught. So you're actually, I don't know if this is a new discipline or it's just a fresh look, because you're combining haplotype genetics and language and oral tradition to verify. Well, you're verifying oral tradition essentially with modern techniques. It's kind of like what you're doing against Darwinism and for creationism. Is there a new term for this, or is this just real science as opposed to scientism?
I'd say there's an element where the pieces exist to some degree in mainstream science right now, but mainstream science is unable to connect them, ultimately because of their time frame. So just to give an example of this, in mainstream science, historically, archaeology as a field, as a discipline, precedes genetics. And the mainstream view of there was a migration 15,000 years ago, a single migration, no connections between old world and new for the next 14,500 years until Columbus. All that is driven in part by archaeology, and they literally layer genetics on top of that framework. So there's a paper in 2016, major paper on looking at the male inherited Y chromosome DNA, and one of their term is a sanity check, literally. One of their sanity checks to make sure their global analysis of the DNA of mankind is working is they say, we found the Native American branch and we made sure, we were like, breathed a sigh of relief once it lined up and said, yes, 15,000 years ago. So it's a matter almost of doctrine to say that there was a single migration 15,000 years ago. And if that's the time frame, then the connections to indigenous histories and linguistics, all that essentially becomes cloudy and vague, and the links are not obvious. I've got a different time scale. That's what adds this very well anchored calendar date to the Red Record, the Lenni Lenape, the Wallam of their migration, and it shows these overlaps with linguistics, allows us to line up with genetic sites and such. So that's, I think, what's been the key. There is this field out there. There is mainstream archaeology. There's mainstream genetics. There is somewhat of an attempt to engage the indigenous histories, but the mainstream view contradicts the indigenous histories. And so there's the kind of hard stop for that investigation. This other view that
that's peer pressure, and you got to get published, and that's very political. I don't have to tell you that. I'm sure you're familiar with that, even though you are, widely published. But there is I think it's Deborah Running Horse has published going back to the native horse issue, where she's used original records showing vast horse herds, and also doing the mathematics and saying these horse herds could not have generated in the time frame that they said they existed. They've also found the remains. They've also found lots of pictographs. Yes, the Europeans brought horses. The Spanish brought horses, but there was a native horse here. And again, the single migration, it's so simplistic. It's childlike to think that, plus, have you done anything on the Polynesian navigators? Have you looked at that? Because a while back there was they rebuilt a traditional long canoe, Samoan based, but I think it wasn't out of Samoa, but they got a traditional navigator that navigates by stars, by currents, by water temperature, and he hit the mark exactly, showing that they could make it. Where Kontiki guys, they just drifted, and they were lucky. But this was, again, oral traditions in inner technologies of indigenous peoples that were just amazing. Have you seen, you know what I'm talking about?
There's about 4 different elements that I think relate to this that make it a very fascinating question. One is, what is the archaeology of the Pacific Islanders? And I was surprised to learn that there's little evidence of the very distant migrations to, let's say, Hawaii, Easter Island, and so on, until just a couple centuries before European contact. The Polynesians had made it, I think, to Samoa, I think, by about 700 BC. They were already there, but for whatever reason, they seem to have stopped and didn't go further. But once they got going again, there seemed to be no boundaries to where they could achieve. Could they achieve the Americas? It seems difficult not to believe. So there's one element. What does the archaeology say? Second is, what do the Polynesian histories themselves say? And the native Hawaiian histories, I think, talk about when they got to Hawaii, they said there were these menehune, I think is their term, little people. And I was talking to one native Hawaiian lady, and she said, yeah, we just thought it was kind of mythological, or just some sort of odd thing. I said, well, statistically, the shortest people on the planet are Guatemalans and Melanesians. So could this be evidence that it was actually the Melanesians who got to Hawaii first and the Polynesians followed? That becomes significant in a minute. So there's indigenous histories, and my general rule of thumb now is I assume they're true unless there's good reason to think otherwise. And just to give an example of this, for example, with the Native American histories, I have a contact, and this lady was saying, well, this guy over here, you can't trust him because he gave candy to kids. And of course, kids will tell you whatever you want to hear for candy. But this guy, he spoke to our elders. He documented what they said. So, his is a reliable account of what we say is our own history. Fine, good to know. So I don't have a reason to think these Native Hawaiian accounts are wrong. And again, little people is quite plausible, especially when you're in close proximity to very short people like the Melanesians. Now bring in American indigenous accounts, the Peruvians. The Incas. They have an account. Go ahead.
So I'm just excited because I was taught, you'll find most tribes have little people stories. I was taught about the Tuerzums, and somebody said, I've never seen that in an Apache dictionary. I didn't learn it. I learned it from an elder. But if you really are inside the circle, there are always stories about little people. And the
reverse then, as well as what I've seen a lot of the giants, which I know there's been a lot of fantastic ideas about them. I think there might actually be so number one, I think the giant stories are likely true, but I think there might be a pretty prosaic explanation. And that was, you'd reference the Lakota being very tall. I didn't know that. So I've played soccer on Sunday nights with Guatemalans, in which, if we think of David and Goliath.
Very small, yeah. I've worked Guatemala quite a bit.
I'm Goliath, yes. But when I went to the Lakota Treaty Council Conference, 2023, December, I was David. I couldn't believe how tall everyone was. And so if you're a Guatemalan, you're in Mesoamerica, something political happens, you flee, you get into North America, and you run into the Lakota, what are you going to say? You're going to say, those people are giants. They're huge.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just
Yeah.
a natural exclamation. So I think those are legit accounts. What's interesting in the Incan account, so I found out that they had an indigenous account because of a mainstream archaeological textbook in which they poo-poo the Incan account, saying, you can't trust most of it. Maybe it's a sequence of about 13 kings stretching out over about a millennium. Starts in 565 AD, goes up to the point of contact, 1500s. And the mainstream view is, no, this Incan account of their history is likely fantastical, mythological. It's not literally true. Well, the numbers are precise. It agrees with genetics. So here's what gets really interesting. I think it's Pachacuti was one of their kings in the 1300s, 1400s, who the account of the Incan account says he was gone for about 9 months to 12 months. They thought he was dead. He went out, what does it say? I can't remember the exact quote. Basically, went out into the ocean. And it says he came back and brought, among other things, black people. Which, what dark-skinned people are going to be out in the Pacific? Melanesians. And here's where it gets really wild. In the last 5 to 10 years in mainstream science, there was an announcement after a study of the genetics of the Amazonian peoples. And I'll explain the link potentially here to the Peruvians in a minute. The Amazonian peoples, indigenous Amazonian peoples, showed very low levels of genetic linkage to Melanesians and peoples of the Pacific. They were trying to stretch it way back 15,000 years ago, which I think is almost laughable. I mean, the genetic signal in anyone's DNA gets diluted so quickly. To think somehow it's going to be preserved 15,000 years seems ridiculous. Much more likely is, let's say, there were Melanesians captured by Pachacuti. If I'm a Melanesian and I'm captured and brought who knows where to the South American mainland, I'm going to get out of there as soon as I can. And the Amazon is one of the best places to escape to. The Incan account itself says, and of course the Incan Empire was huge, but they say we were never able to conquer the jungles. It was just not the climate for us. And so if you're going to escape, you're going to survive. Your highest chances of not being captured and executed is if you escape into this vast Amazonian jungle. So just a few centuries ago, if there was a Melanesian who came in, escaped, started intermingling with the indigenous Amazonians, that's exactly the type of genetic signal I think we'd expect to see, low levels. And so I think, yes, indeed, there were connections between the indigenous Americans and the Pacific Islanders. It may have been based on the combination of accounts of the Hawaiians and the Peruvians. It may have been Melanesians, at least in South America. Could there have also been Polynesians who went and made it to the Americas before Europeans arrived? Quite possibly. We haven't yet detected it. And I don't know that I have an indigenous account that speaks of it, but it wouldn't surprise me in the least if this is true, because the history in both places is a lot more dynamic than I ever thought it was. So wouldn't be any shock if there was a connection between the pre-European Polynesians and the pre-European Americans, and a deeper genetic study, I think, of both parties might indeed show this to be true.
Well, I think they're the finest navigators in the world from what I've seen. And I don't recall all the details because I'm not of that culture, but let me get to some questions here. I don't have any questions because I'm working to absorb. Yeah, it's a deep show. This is fascinating. Should we read your books in particular sequences to better understand your work, or can we start with Traced without doing injustice to your work?
That's a good question. Let me just sketch briefly what each one does. And I'd say, I think each book is going to be standalone, and the value in reading them in order is more, I'd say, in terms of sort of big picture apologetics, going back to what have the courts said? They said basically do detective work. The nerdy philosophy of science way of saying it would be make testable predictions, put things in print that future experiments can show to be true or false. If you read them in order, that's how you see it unfolding. So 2017, I published Replacing Darwin, The New Origin of Species. That's in the general question of species around the globe, including humans, but we're one of course millions of species. So that's kind of the answer to Darwin's Origin of Species book. Traced fulfills predictions I put in that book, but it's a standalone book looking at the global history of humanity. I've got a chapter in there about the pre-European Americas. They had names, so excuse me, I forgot to get the date. So Traced comes out 2022. In 2017, I said we should see the history of civilization in human DNA if the young Earth timescale is true. 2022, 5 years later, show yes, indeed, we fulfilled this prediction. And then I'm basically carrying the research with traced onward for North America in They Had Names. That just came out in May of this year. That's tracing the history of the North American indigenous people. Each of these, again, is standalone. The topics, again, are origin of species and replacing Darwin, the global history of peoples in Traced, and They Had Names is specifically trying to unravel what exactly went down in North America before Europeans arrived. And it combines genetics and like we mentioned, linguistics and archaeology, and especially indigenous history. So the order doesn't necessarily matter unless you're trying to see, do I actually make predictions and fulfill them? If you read them in order, you can see, yes, this is actually what happens. It's a permanent record then of, yes, creationists have met the standard that the courts have demanded. But if your interest is, let me just know what happened in North America before Columbus, you can go straight to They Had Names, and it should be standalone. In terms of complexity, so my first book, of course, is Replacing Darwin. I know that I'm going to have lots of critics who are going to rake it over the coals. I've got to buttress this argument very well. It's probably the most technical of the three, and things get easier to read as you go along. So if you want to say, let me start with the easiest, They Had Names should be the one that's the least complex, least technical, and you can kind of work backwards if that's your interest. All of them I designed to be understandable. Like I had a pastor read through Replacing Darwin saying, let me help me make this accessible.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Because pastors have so often they have these simplistic explanations, which is they don't do their homework. So I'm glad that's happening. But isn't Darwin? I mean, once microscopes got better and we saw specialized machinery in all the cells, that was it, wasn't it, for Darwin? That was the end.
It should be. Unfortunately, again, based on the court decisions, that has not changed education. And yes. I just found out these statistics last summer.
It's scientism.
Yes. So we've talked about the financial reasons to maintain the status quo. I think there's also a very pedantic explanation, but a very powerful one as to why the community operates the way it does. It's they don't know any different. And I think those who control the levers of power know exactly what they're doing. They know that if you teach someone one thing and never expose them to anything else, they're going to stay that way. And they're going to have a visceral reaction once you expose them to something else. That fits my anecdotal experience when I run into someone who's not familiar with young earth creation science. And I start to, here's this evidence for this, here's this evidence for that. And they react in a visceral way because I'm starting to say things that, without even trying, attack the foundation of their worldview, or it forces them to rethink the world they've taken for granted. And so now you start flailing, and what can I accept as true at all? About anything? Do I have to question everything about my existence?
That's my audience. Every show, cognitive dissonance. So another question is, I have heard there is evidence of Hawaiian Polynesian in the Port Hueneme, Ventura County, California. Have you heard of that?
I have not, but it wouldn't surprise me if evidence like that exists, just because that's if there's no other takeaway, it's the pre-European world was extremely dynamic, and the more we discover, the more it makes me think, well, yes, of course.
There's cocoa and tobacco found in Egyptian mummies that originates, of course, in Native America. This is a good question, and we want to move to here anyway. So how have you maintained your Christian faith as you were educated through our government-run colleges?
I'd say I'm the exception in a sense that proves the rule. So statistics show that, and let me actually give the numbers here, because it's a real game changer for this wider apologetics debate. Just to give the context, one of the questions we get asked most often by journalists is, if we're right, then why does 99% of the scientific community disagree with me? Which that's what surveys show. 99% of PhDs reject creation science, accept evolution. By the way, around 2/3 of them cannot positively affirm a belief in any sort of God. So there's a strong religious element to this too, which is kind of wild. But the answer, of course, is 99% of PhDs are evolutionists, because 99% of college undergraduates go to schools where all they will ever hear is evolution. It's a perfect correlation, evolution in, evolution out, no surprise. And how do you avoid that? So my point here is that's by design. These court cases were fought and won by evolutionists because they believe more than I do that students will end up how they're taught. And really, this is, I think, statistics that are going to be applicable across the board. Whatever issue anyone is fighting, even the political realm, I can almost guarantee it goes back to the schools. And if we had statistics, why do so many people believe this? Because that's what they're taught. Why do so many people? And if anyone wants to accomplish anything in the Western world, I don't see any path except through changing education. That's one of the biggest takeaways right here is you want to change any issue in this country, you have to change the education system. And my enemies know and believe this more than I do, which is why they fight it tooth and nail to maintain the things the way they are. So they've got students going through 99% of them hearing only evolution.
Well, the education system in America is the most left-wing part. And there's plenty of left-wing parts, but I got 2 bachelors, a master's, a couple honorary PhDs, but I think PhDs are the new Pharisees of scientism, and they're protecting their realm. I think it's that simple. And of course, at the source, it's satanically sourced to remove God from anything.
Yes.
But creationism and evolution don't even make sense because what did it evolve from? What is the first cause or the uncaused cause anyway? Which, they never have an answer for either. But let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about creation science and young Earth. My wife was asking if you are a proponent of young Earth, and I suppose you are. I've seen the new dinosaurs eating each other in mid-bite because that kind of blows the whole hey, this happened over billions and billions of years because the thing's actually biting the tail of the other thing. So tell me about that.
Yes, young Earth, and just I failed to answer the previous question. How did I make it through? Because I was educated differently before college. So I was homeschooled through 8th grade. I went to a small Christian high school where it was explicitly young Earth creation. And I mean, we were taught evolution. And I think this is really essential for anyone, let's say parents, grandparents. How do I prepare my kids, my grandkids? How can any student survive college? And in short, I'd say the answer is to read double. So let me tell a side story here that I think is very relevant. And I read and looked back my own life with gratitude to my parents. There was a Christian college professor, University of Texas, Austin, which I lived in Texas 6 years, DFW area, saw plenty of the bumper stickers that said secede. And I think there were other bumper stickers that said, if Texas secedes from the Union, Austin is going to secede from Texas. Keep Austin weird. That was another bumper sticker. So full-on left-wing celebratory station, not a place that's friendly to Christians. And this guy's a Christian professor in journalism, was giving advice to incoming students saying, expect to read double. So any discipline, not just science, but journalism, even English, literature, you're going to hear a left-wing anti-Christian view. If you want to survive, you have to expect to read just as much outside of class as in it. If you want to get a Christian worldview, you're not going to hear it in class, so you have to educate yourself. That's tough if you're taking 16 credits, you're doing full-time, you're doing extracurricular activities. And I think that's part of the reason why so many students get shipwrecked in their faith is they're unprepared. For me, thanks to my parents insisting on homeschooling and then finding a Christian high school and taking me to Can-Ham conferences, not because because of me, but because I'm just grateful to them for having inculcated this. I was reading double before I went to college. And so therefore, there were no surprises. When I went in biology class, and I was interested in science for a while, and so that was kind of the area I was reading in, I didn't hear evolution and think, oh, now what do I do? Oh, I just presented this evidence. What am I going to think? I'd already heard it all before. I'd been taught evolution. I'd been taught creation. I was taught to work through the arguments, work through the evidence, and I was prepared ahead of time. Unlike, again, 99% of students who will hear only evolution. I went into second undergraduate, University of Wisconsin Parkside, and Harvard, which is secular as well, and they only teach evolution. But I had already heard the other side, which again, almost all students will never have heard the other side and hear only one outcome. And that's, I think, critical for any discipline. It works. It worked for me. Again, not because I somehow have this foresight, but my parents had the foresight and had trained me from an early age. And so there was no shipwrecking in college because I was surprised by something or blindsided and had this visceral reaction. It was evidence I'd been taught and could work through, raise my hand when needed, not too much because people aren't paying me to go to college or paying to hear the professors, but that was essential for me surviving, I think, along with having a good local church and people praying for me back home. But in terms of that discipline, the preparedness was hugely important. And again, I think it's just the math that shows this. If you're taught only one thing, you're going to end up that way. So if you can be taught something else ahead of time and prepared to debate the issue ahead of time, where that's just debate 101. Know your opponent's position better than they do. I went into college being able to give their arguments to them because I knew them ahead of time. And so I would say they're not that I won any of them over, but I don't know that they were prepared to try to convince me otherwise. I'm like, hey, this is the answer you want in the test. I don't agree with it, but
no, they never are. They never are, because they're not challenged. You see,
yeah,
that was the whole thing with Charlie Kirk. They had to kill him because he debated, and he debated successfully. So you also you debated, but you also meant what you didn't say it. But I'll say it: you were inoculated.
Yes.
So you have to be inoculated to the evil out there of the system. My kids are homeschooled. They use a Liberty University curriculum, although we're frustrated that it doesn't show any indigenous heritage there. So I add that in all the time. And I'm also, because I was a federal agent and intel and, soldier, I'm always inoculating them to evil, much more so than they want to be. Watch this war movie. But it's really important. I have a wonderful couple in the chaplaincy, in our chaplaincy, that they raised a good, godly Christian daughter, but they didn't inoculate her. She went off and ended up taking drugs and then taking her own life because she was just not inoculated and surrounded by the intentional harm, that exists in that environment. Michael says, life lessons trump diplomas, certificates. I know so many called not educated who are the most successful. Yes, read. Yeah, read, but debate, I think is important. And pray, because you've got to have great Holy Spirit. We say Holy Spirit. Indians say great Holy Spirit. I just say great Holy Spirit. How about that? It's not, much of a stretch there. But let's get back to creation science and young Earth. Please tell me about how that. I'm not very familiar. I'm on the periphery, but how that is emerging and going against scientism.
Yes. So I'll sketch here's the biblical derivation for young Earth creationists, and then how that plays out scientifically, and then also in the debate. So young Earth creationists like me would say we read Genesis plainly. It seems to describe a creation of everything, the universe, in 6 days. If you add up the years and the genealogies, which are yes, there's different manuscripts, but the most you can get back is maybe 7,000 years. But the manuscripts I go with, Masoretic text for Genesis and others, and you look at the genealogies in Genesis 5, Genesis chapter 11, that takes you from Adam down to Abraham. Of course, New Testament takes you from Abraham down to Jesus. Jesus is about 2,000 years ago. Anyway, it adds up to about 6,000 years ago that God creates everything perfect, vegetarian. That's what it says in Genesis 1. And that after Adam and Eve sinned, God curses the creation. That's where predation and predatory behavior comes from. After
our fallen nature, our fallen nature,
yes,
human nature.
The whole world goes corrupt. Even Genesis 6 even seems to imply that perhaps the animals were violent as well. So God destroys the entire planet except for Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives. 8 people on board the ark, along with the land-dependent, air-breathing, 2 of every kind of animal. So this is a key
genetically corrupted. It was genetically corrupted, I think, back then. It's exactly what we're seeing again now.
Yes, and God takes 2 of every kind on board the ark. So there's a key point of distinction from what Darwin was arguing against. So in 1859, Darwin's trying to attack the view of species fixity, that God creates every species, number one, rather than kinds, and I'll explain the distinction in a minute, and that God puts them in their current locations, which I don't think fits Genesis 6 through 8, because it says whatever the original locations were, God destroyed the planet with a global flood, deposited miles of fossil sediment, and the animals restarted in the Middle East and migrated to the present location. So there's a number of arguments that Darwin made that I'm like, well, yes, that's actually biblical. Animals migrated to their present locations because they left the ark and migrated from there somewhere in the Middle East to the islands and other places that we see. And in terms of kinds, so Noah's commanded to bring 2 of every kind on board the ark. Unfortunately, some English Bibles say species, but I think a better term just based on which animals can actually interbreed and a variety of other technical scientific concepts. The better approximation of what a kind is not species or even genus, but family. So a good example of this would be the family Felidae, which includes everything from lions to house cats. Can a male lion breed with a female house cat? No. But we know from other studies that the lions, the big cats, can breed with medium-sized cats, and then the medium-sized cat can breed with smaller cats, of course, with house cats. There is a reproductive continuum, and so it's likely that all 30-plus species of cats descended from one pair on board the Ark. So the young Earth view, and actually, I should clarify this. This actually goes back to Linnaeus. It's a straightforward reading of Scripture, but even Linnaeus himself, 1700s, even though he started believing that God created every species, later in life he said, wait a minute, there's different kinds of species that can breed. I think what God created is actually higher than that. So Darwin's attacking really a caricature of the creation view. Anyway, so these come off the Ark. In terms of human history, Genesis 10:11 talk about everyone being in one place, and God tells them to spread out. They say no at the Tower of Babel, so God forces them to spread out, confuses their languages, and this is the origin of the initial ethno-linguistic group, so everyone goes back to this family. And the book Traced, I should add, is where I show that if you look at male inherited DNA, you could actually see the echo of this event. Genesis 10 is a genealogy of men, the sons of Noah and their sons and grandsons and great-grandsons. You can see the mirror image of this, one of the biggest discoveries in the last 5 years, at the base of a family tree based on male inherited DNA. It's one of the profoundest echoes of the biblical anthropology. You can see that in the book Traced. Every people group on the planet can trace their origins back to specific sons of Noah. And again, it's this view that is confirming the indigenous histories of the peoples themselves, returning dignity and value to them. So that's the, I would say in a nutshell, the young earth creationist view, that Babel and flood is about 4,500 years ago. This, in terms of its scientific foundations, goes back to about 1961, the Genesis flood, where Henry Moore says, wait a minute, if you look at sort of the big picture fossil record, it's supposedly a record of millions, hundreds of millions of years of history. Well, there's a lot of evidence, and this research has continued, showing that it looks like, so really there's two ways to explain it. There's slow processes, long periods of time, or catastrophic processes in a short period of time. And there's ongoing research, some of my colleagues continue it, showing that, for example, the Grand Canyon cut quickly. The layers in the Grand Canyon, you've got, and this is research from the Institute from Creation Research as well. There's layers that span the continent. So big effect, whole continent layer of deposition, geologic layer implies major catastrophic cause, which of course global flood would do that. So that's the geologic beginnings in a sense, though it goes back even further. But in terms of the modern young earth creationist view and the science behind it, goes back 1961, Genesis flood. The Institute for Creation Research is founded in 1970. I actually was there for 6 years, 2009, 2015, before I came to Answers in Genesis. And the research in geology, paleontology, astronomy, biology, especially now that's my field, has just exploded in the last several decades. I'd say the last major hurdle for the whole field is this public school question. If you can change what's taught in public schools, you will change the culture. That's what my enemies know. That's why they fight so hard to keep it. But there's been four decades now of progress in creation science, meeting the standards as the court have said. So we have the basis, if we want to relitigate it. And there's really, I don't think, anything they can do. And just to add some exclamation points to this, because there's, of course, the legal court, which seems to be growing more corrupt by the day, but there's the court of public opinion. And this research, especially on Native Americans, which meets the court standard, seems to also find an audience in the court of public opinion. And beyond that, it's even opening doors to the Native American community themselves. So the highest example of this being the Lakota, the executive director of the Lakota Treaty Council Conference invited me to speak at their conference in December 2023. They're very traditional, almost anti-Christian in some senses, to the point where I thought, why do they invite me, an open Christian, open creationist? And I think the answer is because it's one of the only scientific views that returns dignity and value to them. I'm
Yes.
strongly persuaded that their long account of migration, where they say we came from, going back to the AD 800s, 800, near Washington, D.C., and migrated westward through probably what's now Ohio, Indiana, northern part of Illinois, into Wisconsin. Then they allied with the Algic, defeated the Salegas. All that, I think we will find within this young earth creationist view strong genetic confirmation. And So again, there's the court of public opinion, and there's the whole social justice side, in a sense. Here it's the biblical view that's returning dignity and value to the minorities, not taking it away. And so I think there's real potential for this issue finally being able to break down the wall, break open the doors back to public education, which if you change that, again, you will change the culture.
Well, public school is such a wreck. I mean, non-binary is a joke in the first place. It's all satanic lies to get back at the creator by getting back at the creation. From a warrior perspective, it's got to be simple from my point of view. But that's something else I want to ask you about. So you always are inviting indigenous folks to contact you and help you with your work. And you were just mentioning you were invited to the Lakota Council. So I guess you're finding a lot of acceptance. I certainly found that very welcoming, but that was a long time ago. I think at least what I've seen now is more racial, talking about color. It's not about color. It's about culture. It always was about being adopted, but it sounds like you're being, well accepted and welcomed into these council circles. And of course, why can you blame their view of Christianity? The way Christianity has been, like, for example, I always say the first thing what they did with the Indian schools is cut the buckskins off. Well, if you're following scripture, buckskins are the first clothes that God gives Adam and Eve. So, if you're really following scripture, you should have left the buckskins, but that's not really what they were teaching there. So tell me about that Lakota Council a little bit, or some of the other councils you've been speaking with.
I'd say in general, it's a very slow process of getting to know one another and passive. So I've had plenty of mistakes along the way, learned lessons the hard way. About 5, 6, 7 years ago, when I first was learning about the genetic implications for pre-European Americas, I was in my naive enthusiasm, cold calling reservations, and hey, I got to tell you about this. At least one, as soon as they find out I'm a geneticist or historian. So fast forward to when Traced comes out, 2022. And we do a series of videos inviting people to contact us, which about 5 or 6 Native Americans did. One of them said, "This is the way to do it. We contact you. You don't contact us. You contact us. We're not going to speak to you." I said, "Thank you very much for that helpful advice. That would explain my experience. I will continue on this path then." And that's how the Lakota Treaty Council invitation came about. We kept doing videos 2022, 2023. And so fall of 23, I think the executive director had seen one of the videos and reached out. So all of them, we give a website. So it's answersingenesis.org/go. Back then it was /traced. Now it's /they-had-names. So answersingenesis.org/go/they-had-names, where you can find a message box, goes to my email. He emailed me that way. We had an initial series of Zoom meetings. I think one of the first ones he said was, "My job is to prove the white man wrong." I thought, well, better be careful what I say then. And by the second meeting, he said, "Well, now we're friends. Would you come speak?" I thought, oh, well, that was sudden. So sure. And that approach of, hey, we're doing research, we're putting it out there. If you're interested, you can contact me. So I've got contacts in about, I should say contacts with people, and especially men, because it was initially very focused on the male inherited DNA, from about 30 or so different nations, not necessarily leadership, but it was a diversity of peoples. Most of them I'd say would be professing Christians, but there were some not necessarily. Again, the Lakota very traditional in their approach and almost anti-Christian. But it's been I'll wait for them to contact me. But the ones who have seem to have been open, intrigued. I mean, wary and cautious, as you might expect. I don't expect any different. Again, as you mentioned, the history between Caucasians and Native Americans over the years. So research for me continues. I've still got an arm up here in North America, but to me it's at the pace of whatever Native Americans decide. And in the meantime, while that sort of slowly burns, there's research I'm doing in Latin America, Central America, the Amazon.
Oh, really?
So yes, and next book will likely be on the Mayans and the bigger implications for Central America. And my hope is eventually in the Amazon as well, understand what happened before then. But that's a bit of a tougher nut to crack. Learning Spanish, so I can. I
wanted to ask you about an analogy between the Mexica, the Aztecas, how they conquered and subjugated tribes around them, and when the conquistadors come in, they don't just kill off the history books say they just defeat the Aztecs because they think it's the returning Quetzalcoatl. Actually, they draw from the tribes that had been subjugated and build up an indigenous force. That's actually what happens. And so I wondered if there was a similar thing that happened in North America, if you hypothesized anything like that.
Yes, and that's kind of what I had in mind with the sort of an alternate scenario. Let's say the Telegas, the Mississippians, the Cahokians, the Natchez, their empire in the southeast, that Mississippian culture, which was from, just to sketch the full geographic extent, the Mississippian culture is basically from St. Louis all the way down to the Gulf Coast in Louisiana, across to the Atlantic, over the northern part of Florida. It's a pretty large area, culturally unified, which gets broken up then when the capital is overthrown. And I think you see a lot of history played out in North America of divide and conquer, whether that was a deliberate strategy or just simply how it played out. I think the disunity is what, in a sense, was the Achilles heel for Native Americans. There was not a pan.
They were too free to unify against, get the Tecumseh and Cochise, getting everybody together. We'd still be fighting in from the coast, I think.
Yes. So the fact that there was such disunity, and oh wait, if I ally with the European Americans, then I can defeat these enemies over here. And that's, I think, what ultimately spelled the doom for the North American ones. Whether it was as extreme, let's say, as happened in Mesoamerica, where, no, we don't want to send our sons to do the latest sacrifices.
Whoops, you froze there. Are you there?
Oh, yes, I can hear you. Sorry.
Okay, we froze there for a second. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, whether there's the same, I guess, extent of the disunity, and of course with the Aztecs, there's the, no, if you're a neighboring tribe to the Aztecs, no, I don't want to send my sons to be the sacrifice. So strong nation to ally. Continental squabbles, let's say. Then you have this motivation, of course, to ally with European Americans. And that, again, I think is what is one of the reasons ultimately the European Americans.
Oh, you must be getting some weather there.
Mine, I think, keeps
you're
changing.
You're a little fractured there.
Let me see if I can close a few things here, and maybe that'll help it. Am I, is it unfrozen now?
Yeah, it's unfrozen now.
Okay.
Yeah. So somebody says a humble approach helps. That's very true. When I was being taught about what it meant to be in day, was being a humble two-legged before the Creator. I actually remember being told that at a pre-ceremony, always being a humble two-legged. But please go ahead.
Oh, I think the disunity, yes, absolutely plays a role. I don't know that it was as extreme, let's say, in Mesoamerica, but the fact that there was not a pan-Indian or continent-wide unity is ultimately, I think, what spelled the downfall of the Native American communities that were here.
But I think that happened because of the Aztecan death cult empires and the Cahokia death cult empire. I think they were just, at least that's what I have been taught, is, I didn't understand it at the time. This is talking in the 70s and 80s, but it's kind of the apocalypto thing. I thought the apocalypto sums that up really well. But what you're really describing here is a very coherent global worldview, but right down to North, Central, and South America, where all the pieces are finally starting to fit, which has never happened before, as far as I know.
Yes, that's been what's so exciting for me, is whether it's North, Central, or South. I guess Central could be a little bit of an exception, but I basically learned nothing. Yes, I maybe heard of the Aztecs, maybe heard of the Mayans, but it seemed, I know growing up, it seemed somewhat irrelevant because the artistic style, the culture just seemed different than north of the Rio Grande. And of course, now come to find out, there's plenty of connections between tribes north of the Rio Grande and south of it, all throughout pre-European American history. So Central American history is intimately connected to North American history before Europeans arrived. And to be able to even see that has been very exciting, and to be able to reconstruct a play-by-play of what went down here, and in a sense elevate the history again up to what we learned for Europe, history of Western civilization. That's been refreshing. And one of the goals of the project is to see this taught in schools, so people don't grow up like I did, which is ignorant of those who came before and even of those who remain.
Well, if you're giving a voice to the tribes, I mean, that's the way to go about that, because they have been silenced. And, somebody said first they massacred us and then they forgot that they massacred us. That I think that's the way to go. So how many tribes have you talked to now?
I have connections into about 30 of them, not necessarily at the leadership level. So it varies. And we're going to continue to do videos and such. And I should add here, a lot of the videos we've done are on the Answers in Genesis main YouTube channel. We're shifting a lot of my content now over to my own YouTube channel. So it's just Nathaniel_JEANSON. And we're going to have a big one in a couple days, day after Thanksgiving, where there are Mayans at the first Thanksgiving. So more of that. Wait a minute.
Really?
What do you mean links between Central America and North America? So that'll be a really interesting
because
episode.
of the turkey. Because, well, there wasn't a turkey there. There's venison and fish. The turkey's big in Central America, wasn't big in North America.
The short answer is it goes back to some genetic linkages that were really surprising, but the events I think make sense, or at least I should say, in retrospect, once we start putting the genetic pieces together, it's like, oh, okay, now I see how this is plausible. But I never thought about the first Thanksgiving in that way. So anyway, just an example of research that's ongoing.
And so that's not going to be on. That's not going to be on Answers in Genesis. That's going to be on your new channel.
That'll be on my Nathaniel JEANSON YouTube channel. Correct.
Okay, we will look for that. I will check that out as well. Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for all that you're doing for the tribes. I have a great debt to the Apache and Dakota people that have always welcomed me in. So I really appreciate what you're doing and honoring them, and of course, honoring God. And hope you have a wonderful and blessed Thanksgiving.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to chat and talk about one of my favorite subjects.
Well, we'd love to have you back because it's the audience is loving it, and I'd love to have you back, and we'll talk more in the future, because I think you're really, it's almost a whole new branch of science, and you're getting buy-in from the indigenous people themselves. It's very unique, very exciting. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. So that was Nathaniel JEANSON, a fascinating guy with fascinating work. And I think that he's going to do even greater good. Yeah, fascinating indeed, says, give me some of that. So they had lost everything, reeling from repression, savaged by sickness and starvation, their number cut in half by death, poor and possessionless, save for their new English language Holy Geneva Bible. Yet, just as a destiny of defeat loomed, suddenly saved by Tisquantum, speaking English, greeting them as a Christian brother, and then asking for beer. So they chose gratitude over grief, burying their sadness while planting the three sisters, remembering the rock, kneeling and noticing the sand as solid ground at long last, but reminded that he sees every angle of every facet of every granule inside and out, now and before and to be, in relation to each other, forming the stand for their sepulchre, each fitting perfectly, not peacefully, justly, not fairly, each with the other, forming the free land from the deep. Perhaps they learned to see as their Patuxent rescuer the autumn leaves falling carelessly where they will, yet each in perfect place. How then could they not be brimming with gratitude? So then, how too can I not be? Wishing you a blessed, sacred Thanksgiving.